Catherine's frozen feet felt like blocks of ice inside her leather boots, and the pain was so intense she could barely think straight. She'd only been walking from the stagecoach to the railroad camp's supply office, maybe 200 yards through the Idaho Territory snow, but the blizzard had come out of nowhere, and she'd gotten turned around in the whiteout. By the time she'd stumbled through the door of what she thought was the office but turned out to be a worker's cabin, she couldn't feel her toes at all. The man who caught her as she collapsed looked up from the fireplace he'd been stoking, his brown eyes widening in alarm as he took in her snow-covered form and blue-tinged lips. He was broad-shouldered and strong, with sandy blonde hair that fell across his forehead and hands that looked like they could break timber, but moved with surprising gentleness as he guided her to the chair nearest the fire. Now those same hands were unlacing her boots with careful efficiency, and Catherine wanted to protest, to tell him she could manage herself. But her fingers wouldn't cooperate, and the words wouldn't come through her chattering teeth. When he pulled off the first boot, and then the woolen stocking beneath, she heard him suck in a sharp breath. She didn't need to look to know it was bad. The pale white color of frostbite. The complete lack of feeling. She'd seen it before on a girl back in Boston, back when she was still Catherine Miller instead of Catherine Hayes. Back before Marcus Dalton had destroyed everything and forced her to flee west with a new name and nothing but her sewing skills to keep her alive. The railroad worker, Daniel someone had called him when she'd inquired about seamstress work at the camp, knelt before her and began to work on her other boot. His movements were methodical, but not rough. And when he finally had both feet bare, he didn't recoil from the sight the way most men would. Instead, he moved closer to the fire, positioning himself so that his body blocked the worst of the heat from hitting her feet directly. Too much warmth too fast would cause more damage. She knew that much. What she didn't know was what he planned to do next. He looked up at her then, and Catherine felt something shift in her chest at the intensity in those brown eyes. They were the color of rich earth after rain, she thought hazily, still shivering despite the fire. "This is going to be uncomfortable," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the small cabin. "But I need to warm your feet slowly, and my hands are the best way." He paused, his jaw tightening slightly. "I know this isn't proper, and I apologize for the intimacy of it. But if I don't do this now, you could lose your toes. Maybe your whole foot." Catherine tried to nod, tried to tell him she understood, but all that came out was another violent shiver. Daniel didn't wait for permission. He cupped her right foot between both his palms, his skin rough with calluses from years of hard labor, but surprisingly warm, and began to massage with slow, careful strokes. The touch sent shock waves through her body. Not from pain, though, that would come later. She knew. But from the sheer intimacy of having a strange man's hands on her bare skin. In Boston, such a thing would have been scandalous beyond measure. A man touching a woman's ankle was cause for gossip. But this wasn't Boston, and desperate times called for desperate measures. She watched him work, unable to look away. His face was intent, focused entirely on the task before him, and there was something beautiful in that concentration. His fingers moved from her heel to her arch, to each individual toe, pressing and rubbing in small circles, willing warmth back into frozen flesh. Catherine bit her lip hard enough to taste blood, determined not to make a sound even as feelings started to return in sharp, needle-like pricks of agony. She wouldn't cry. She'd left crying behind in Boston along with everything else. But Daniel must have seen something in her face, because he glanced up, his hands never stopping their work, and said, "It's all right to hurt. I've had frostbite twice. I know what it feels like when the blood starts moving again." His voice was matter of fact, not pitying, and somehow that made it easier to breathe. Talk to me. Tell me something. Anything to take your mind off it. I'm supposed to start work tomorrow, Catherine heard herself say, her voice still shaky but stronger than before. I'm the new seamstress. The camp manager hired me to mend clothes and make winter gear for the workers. She paused, watching his hands continue their steady massage. I've been sewing since I was 6 years old. My mother taught me. Said a woman with a skill would never starve. Daniel nodded, switching to her left foot now, his touch just as careful, just as warm. Smart woman, your mother. What brings a seamstress all the way out to a railroad camp in Idaho territory in the middle of winter? Most women wait until spring to travel. There was no judgment in the question, only curiosity, but Catherine felt her spine stiffen anyway. He was already too close, seeing too much. She couldn't tell him the truth. Couldn't explain about Marcus Dalton and the false accusations and the scandal that had driven her from Boston 6 months ago. So she settled for a version of the truth that left out the dangerous parts. I needed a fresh start, she said simply. And winter jobs pay better. Fewer people willing to travel in the snow means less competition for positions. She tried for a smile, though her face still felt half frozen. Besides, I'm not afraid of a little cold weather. That earned her a raised eyebrow and the ghost of a smile from Daniel. A little cold weather? Miss, it's 20 below out there before you factor in the wind. This is deep winter in Idaho territory, the kind of cold that kills if you're not careful. His hands pressed firmly against the ball of her foot, working the flesh with sure strokes. You're lucky you stumbled into my cabin instead of getting lost out there. Another 10 minutes and you wouldn't have made it. The reality of how close she'd come to death settled over Catherine like a heavy blanket. She'd been so focused on getting away from Boston, on putting as much distance as possible between herself and Marcus Dalton, that she hadn't really thought about the dangers of the journey itself. The stagecoach driver had warned her about the weather, had suggested she wait a few days for the storm to pass, but she'd insisted on leaving immediately. Patience had never been one of her virtues, her mother used to say. And impatience had nearly cost Catherine her life tonight. She looked at Daniel properly for the first time, really seeing him instead of just the blur of a stranger helping her. He was younger than she'd first thought, probably early 30s, with a face that had seen sun and wind and hard work, but hadn't yet been worn down by it. There was strength in the line of his jaw, in the breadth of his shoulders, but also something gentler in the way he touched her. The way he'd taken time to explain what he was doing, instead of just doing it. His hands were still moving, still coaxing warmth and circulation back into her feet, and Catherine found herself mesmerized by the sight. Such capable hands. Such unexpected tenderness from a man who looked like he could split logs all day without breaking a sweat. How long have you worked on the railroad? She asked, needing to fill the silence that had fallen between them, needing to think about something other than the strange flutter in her chest every time his thumbs pressed against her arch. 5 years, Daniel replied, his gaze still fixed on his work. Started as a track layer, worked my way up to foreman last year. It's hard work, dangerous sometimes, but it pays well and I like building something that matters. These rails are connecting the country, bringing people and goods to places that were wilderness just a few years ago. He glanced up at her, and Catherine saw pride in his expression. It's good work, honest work. There was something in the way he said honest work that made Catherine wonder if he'd known dishonest work before. If he had his own past he was trying to outrun. But she didn't ask. She had no right to pry into his history when she was keeping her own so carefully hidden. Instead, she nodded and said, "Building something that matters. That's a good way to spend a life." "What about sewing?" Daniel asked, his hands moving to her ankles now, checking for any other signs of frostbite. "Does that feel like building something that matters to you?" Catherine considered the question, surprised by how much she wanted to answer honestly. "It does," she said finally. "Every stitch is a small act of care, of making something useful or beautiful or warm. I once made a wedding dress for a bride whose family couldn't afford to buy one from a shop. She cried when she saw it, said she'd never felt so beautiful in her life." The memory brought a real smile to Catherine's face. That mattered. That was worth something. Daniel looked at her for a long moment, his brown eyes thoughtful, and Catherine felt heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire. Then he nodded and said, "I think you're going to do well here, Miss Hayes. We need people who understand that kind of caring in a place like this. It gets rough out here, especially in winter. Anything that reminds men they're still civilized, still human, that's valuable." He released her feet gently, settling them on a folded blanket he pulled from somewhere, and stood up to add more wood to the fire. Catherine wiggled her toes experimentally and was relieved to feel all of them respond, though the pain was still considerable. Pins and needles coursed through both feet, a sure sign that circulation was returning. She'd be sore for days, probably wouldn't be able to wear proper shoes for a while, but she would heal. She would keep all her toes, thanks to this stranger who'd known exactly what to do and hadn't hesitated to do it despite the impropriety. "Thank you," Catherine said, and meant it more than she'd meant anything in a long time. "You saved my life tonight, Mr. Daniel. I won't forget that." He turned from the fire, his face partly in shadow now, and shook his head. "Just Daniel. No Mr. needed. And you're welcome, but you should probably stay here tonight instead of trying to make it to the women's quarters. The storm's getting worse, and you need to keep those feet warm and elevated." He gestured to the narrow cot against the far wall. "You take the bed. I'll sleep by the fire." Catherine's first instinct was to protest, to insist she couldn't possibly put him out of his own bed. But one look at his face told her arguing would be pointless. This wasn't a man who made offers he didn't mean. And truth be told, she wasn't sure she could walk even if she wanted to. The pain in her feet was intensifying now that feeling had fully returned, throbbing in time with her heartbeat. So instead of arguing, she simply nodded and said, "Thank you." Again. Daniel helped her to the cot, his arms steady around her waist as she hobbled the short distance. She sank onto the thin mattress with relief, and he brought her the blanket her feet had been resting on, tucking it around her with the same careful attention he'd shown while warming her frozen feet. Then he brought her a tin cup of water from the bucket by the door, and a piece of hardtack from his supplies. Not much of a meal, but Catherine's stomach was still too unsettled from cold and shock to want anything more. As she sipped the water, she watched Daniel settle himself on the floor near the fire, his back against the wall, his long legs stretched out before him. He'd pulled a heavy coat over his shoulders like a blanket, and his eyes were already starting to close. Exhausted, she realized. He'd probably worked a full shift before coming back to his cabin to find a frozen woman on his doorstep. Yet, he'd given up his bed without complaint and planned to spend the night on a hard floor to make sure she was safe. What kind of man did that for a stranger? In Boston, the men Catherine had known would have calculated the cost and benefit before lifting a finger to help. They would have demanded gratitude, payment, favors. Marcus Dalton certainly had. But Daniel asked for nothing, expected nothing. He'd simply done what needed doing because it was right. Catherine lay back on the cot, her feet still throbbing but bearable now, and pulled the rough wool blanket up to her chin. Through the cabin's single window, she could see snow falling thick and fast, the wind howling like something wild and hungry. Deep winter. In Idaho territory, the kind of cold that kills. She'd been so focused on running from her past that she hadn't truly considered what she was running toward. A railroad construction camp in the middle of nowhere. A job that would barely pay enough for room and board. A winter that stretched ahead like an endless white expanse. But as she drifted towards sleep, her last coherent thought wasn't about danger or hardship, or the mistakes she'd made back east. It was about the warmth of Daniel's hands on her frozen feet, the gentleness in those calloused palms, and the way his brown eyes had looked at her like she mattered, like saving her life was the most natural thing in the world. Maybe Idaho territory wouldn't be so bad after all. Catherine woke to pale winter light filtering through the cabin window and the smell of coffee brewing on the stove. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then memory flooded back along with a fresh wave of throbbing pain in her feet. She pushed herself up on her elbows and saw Daniel at the small iron stove, pouring coffee into 2 tin cups. He must have heard her moving, because he turned and offered a slight smile. "How are the feet?" he asked, bringing her one of the cups. The coffee was strong and bitter but blessedly hot, and Catherine wrapped her hands around the tin gratefully. "They hurt," she admitted. "But I can feel them, which I suppose is the important thing." She glanced down at her feet, still wrapped in the blanket, and wiggled her toes again. Everything moved the way it should, though the pain made her wince. Daniel nodded, settling himself on the edge of the cot with his own coffee. Up close in the morning light, Catherine could see details she'd missed the night before. The small scar above his left eyebrow, the laugh lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled more often than he frowned. The way his work shirt stretched across his shoulders when he moved. She forced her gaze back to her coffee cup, suddenly aware of how rumpled she must look after sleeping in her dress, her hair half fallen from its pins. "The storm passed around midnight," Daniel said, either not noticing her discomfort or politely ignoring it. "But we got about 2 feet of new snow. The paths between buildings will be cleared by mid-morning. I can help you to the women's quarters then, if you're feeling up to it." Catherine nodded, grateful for his matter-of-fact tone. No awkwardness about their forced proximity during the night. No inappropriate comments or suggestions. Just practical help offered without expectation. It was refreshing in a way that made her chest tighten with an emotion she couldn't quite name. "I'd appreciate that," she said. "I should check in with Mr. Patterson, the camp manager, and see about getting settled into my workspace." They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, drinking their coffee and listening to the sounds of the camp coming to life outside. Men's voices calling to each other, the scrape of shovels against snow, the distant whistle of the camp's work bell. Catherine found herself reluctant to leave the warmth and quiet of the cabin, which was ridiculous. She had work to do, a new life to build. She couldn't spend all morning sitting in a railroad worker's cabin, drinking coffee and trying not to notice how the firelight caught the gold in his sandy hair. But when Daniel finally set down his cup and said, "I should get you those boots," Catherine felt a pang of something that might have been disappointment. He rummaged in a wooden trunk near the door and pulled out a pair of worn but serviceable work boots, much too large for her feet, but better than nothing. "These were my brother's," he explained, bringing them over. "He worked on the railroad with me for a year before deciding farm life suited him better. Went back to Ohio last spring. I kept his extra gear in case he changed his mind." Daniel knelt before her again, and Catherine's breath caught as she realized he intended to put the boots on her himself. "I can manage," she said quickly, but he shook his head. "Your feet are still healing. Let me help." His hands were just as gentle as they'd been the night before, easing her feet into the oversized boots and lacing them loosely so as not to restrict circulation. Catherine kept her gaze fixed on the top of his head, watching the way his hair fell forward as he worked, and told herself the flutter in her stomach was just nerves about starting her new job. Nothing more. When both boots were secure, Daniel stood and offered his hand to help her up. Catherine took it, his palm warm and solid against hers, and rose carefully to her feet. The boots felt strange, the pain in her feet still considerable. But she could stand. She could walk. That was enough. "Ready?" Daniel asked, pulling on his heavy coat and opening the cabin door. The blast of cold air that hit them made Catherine gasp, but she nodded and stepped out into the brilliant white world beyond. The railroad camp spread before her, a collection of rough wooden buildings half buried in snow. Men were everywhere, clearing paths, hauling supplies, working on the massive steel rails that stretched east and west as far as she could see. This was going to be her home now. These rough men her neighbors and clients. This frozen wilderness her refuge from the scandal she'd left behind. Daniel's hand was steady at her elbow as they made their way slowly through the snow-packed paths. He didn't rush her, didn't complain when she had to stop twice to catch her breath and let the pain in her feet ease. He just waited, patient and solid, as the mountains rising in the distance. Other workers called out greetings to him as they passed, their eyes curious when they saw Catherine. She could imagine what they were thinking. The new seamstress, already attached to the foreman. But Daniel didn't seem to notice or care about the looks. He just kept walking, guiding her toward a long building near the center of camp that turned out to be the women's quarters. The building was divided into small rooms, each barely big enough for a cot, a small stove, and a trunk for belongings. But it was clean and dry, and the stove was already lit when Daniel opened the door to what would be Catherine's space. "Patterson had this prepared yesterday when he got word you were coming," Daniel explained, helping her inside. "Your sewing supplies should arrive on the next freight wagon, probably tomorrow, if the weather holds." Catherine looked around her new home, so different from the Boston townhouse she'd grown up in, with its high ceilings and fine furniture. But this was hers, earned with her own skills, paid for with her own labor. No one could take it from her. No one could use it as leverage to control her. The thought brought a fierce satisfaction that surprised her with its intensity. "Thank you," she said to Daniel, turning to face him. "For everything, the rescue, the care, the help this morning. I know it was an imposition." Daniel shook his head, his brown eyes serious. "No imposition. Just one person helping another. That's how we survive out here." He paused at the door, his hand on the frame. "Patterson will probably come by later to go over your duties. And if you need anything, my cabin is the third one past the supply office." Just knock. Then he was gone, the door closing softly behind him, and Catherine was alone for the first time since she'd stumbled into his cabin the night before. She sank onto the cot, pulled off the 2 large boots, and examined her feet. They were bruised and swollen, still painful, but healing. She'd been lucky, unbelievably, impossibly lucky. If she'd gotten lost just a little longer, if she'd collapsed in the snow instead of making it to Daniel's cabin, she would have died out there. No one would have known what happened to Catherine Hayes, the seamstress from Boston, who'd run away to Idaho Territory with a new name and too many secrets. But she hadn't died. She'd been saved by a railroad worker with gentle hands and kind eyes, who'd given up his bed for a stranger and asked for nothing in return. Catherine lay back on the cot and closed her eyes, her feet propped up on her small trunk, and let herself think about Daniel for just a moment longer. The way his voice had sounded in the dark cabin, the warmth of his hands, the solid strength of his arm around her waist. Then she pushed the thoughts away firmly and sat up again. She was here to work, to build a new life, to leave her past behind, not to develop feelings for the first kind man she met. That way led to complications she couldn't afford. She'd learned that lesson already, painfully, in Boston. Mr. Patterson turned out to be a gruff, efficient man in his 50s, who ran the railroad camp with military precision. He came by late morning with a ledger full of notes about what the workers needed. Pants mended, shirts patched, winter coats reinforced against the brutal cold, heavy work that would keep Catherine busy from dawn until well after dark. He also brought her sewing supplies, which had apparently been stored in the supply office overnight. 2 large crates filled with thread, needles, scissors, bolts of heavy canvas and wool, buttons, and all the other necessities of her trade. Catherine ran her hands over the familiar tools with relief. This she knew how to do. This was solid ground. Patterson watched her unpack with approval in his eyes. "Daniel says you nearly froze to death last night," he said bluntly. "Told me he had to warm your feet by the fire. Lucky he was there." Catherine felt heat rise in her cheeks at the memory, but nodded. "Very lucky. He saved my life." Patterson grunted, making a note in his ledger. "Daniel's a good man, best foreman I've got. Works harder than anyone, and never asks his men to do anything he wouldn't do himself. You could do worse than making a friend of him out here." There was something knowing in the way Patterson said it that made Catherine's spine stiffen. "I'm here to work, Mr. Patterson, not to make friends or anything else." The camp manager raised his hands in mock surrender. "No offense intended, Miss Hayes. Just saying it's a hard place for a woman alone. Having someone you can trust makes a difference." He tapped his ledger. "I'll send the first batch of mending over this afternoon. Pay is monthly, room and board included." "Any questions?" Catherine shook her head, and Patterson left her to her unpacking. She spent the rest of the day organizing her supplies and testing the small stove to make sure she could heat the room adequately while she worked. The first batch of clothes arrived as promised, carried by a young worker who couldn't have been more than 18 and who blushed furiously when Catherine thanked him. 20 pairs of work pants with torn knees or split seams. 15 shirts missing buttons or worn through at the elbows. 6 heavy coats that needed reinforcement and patching. Enough work to keep her busy for days. Catherine settled at the small table by her window, positioned her oil lamp for maximum light, and began to sew. The familiar rhythm of needle through fabric, the pull of thread, the small satisfaction of watching something broken become whole again. This was meditation, therapy, purpose. With each stitch, she felt herself settle more firmly into this new life, leaving Catherine Miller of Boston further behind. She was Catherine Hayes now, seamstress, survivor, woman starting over. The past didn't matter anymore. Or at least, that's what she told herself. The days fell into a pattern. Catherine woke before dawn, lit her stove, and began sewing by lamplight. Workers brought clothes to be mended throughout the day, leaving them in a basket outside her door and collecting finished items from another basket. She rarely saw the same man twice, which suited her fine. The less she interacted with people, the less chance someone might recognize her from Boston or know someone who did. The railroad was expanding west, connecting territories, bringing news and travelers from all corners of the country. It wasn't impossible that word of Catherine Miller's scandal might reach Idaho Territory. Unlikely, but not impossible. So she kept to herself, spoke to no one more than necessary, and focused on her work. The one exception was Daniel. He seemed to appear at her door every few days with some excuse or another, bringing her extra firewood because he'd noticed her supply was running low, delivering a particularly heavy coat that needed mending because the young worker who usually did it had hurt his back, asking if she needed anything from Stone Valley. When the supply wagon made its weekly run, Catherine told herself she found his attention merely polite, nothing more. But she couldn't deny the way her heart lifted when she heard his knock, or the way she found herself listening for his voice among the camp sounds. It was foolish and dangerous, this awareness of him, but she seemed powerless to stop it. 3 weeks after her arrival, the deep winter settled in with a vengeance. Temperatures dropped so low that water froze in buckets within minutes of being brought inside. The wind howled day and night, finding every crack and gap in the cabin walls despite the rags Catherine stuffed around the window frame. The workers' faces grew haggard with cold and exhaustion, their movements slower, their spirits lower. This was the kind of winter that tested men's souls, Patterson said grimly one afternoon when he brought her a new batch of mending. 2 workers had already left, unable to endure the brutal conditions, heading back east on the supply wagon with their tails between their legs. Catherine understood the temptation. Some mornings, she woke so cold she could barely feel her fingers, and it took an hour of huddling by the stove before she could grip a needle properly. But she didn't leave. She'd survived worse than cold. At least winter was an honest enemy, straightforward in its dangers. Not like the treachery she'd fled in Boston. It was during this bitter stretch that Marcus Dalton found her. Catherine was in her cabin on a particularly brutal afternoon, mending a coat by lamplight, because the sky outside was so dark with clouds it might as well have been evening, when she heard the knock. She called out without looking up, "Come in," expecting one of the usual workers with clothes to be mended. Instead, a voice she'd hoped never to hear again said, "Hello, Catherine." Or should I say Miss Hayes now? Quite the creative reinvention. Catherine's needle slipped, stabbing her finger, and she watched blood well up on her fingertip without really seeing it. Her whole body had gone cold in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. Slowly, she looked up and saw Marcus Dalton standing in her doorway, snow melting on his expensive coat, that familiar predatory smile on his handsome face. He was just as she remembered. Dark hair perfectly styled, sharp blue eyes that saw too much, clothes that cost more than most men earned in a month. He'd been her father's business partner, the man who'd swept her off her feet with his charm and sophistication, who'd promised her the world and then destroyed her reputation when she'd refused his increasingly inappropriate demands. The man who'd spread lies about her virtue until no respectable family in Boston would employ her as a seamstress. The man who'd driven her into exile with nothing but a new name and her sewing kit. "What do you want?" Catherine's voice came out steady, despite the terror flooding through her veins. She set down her sewing carefully, buying herself time to think, to plan. Running would do no good. He'd found her once, he could find her again. And where would she run in the middle of an Idaho Territory winter? She had no money saved yet. Nowhere to go, no one to turn to. Marcus stepped fully into the cabin, closing the door behind him with a soft click that sounded like a trap snapping shut. He looked around the small space with obvious disdain, his lip curling slightly. "This is quite a step down from Boston, my dear. A drafty cabin in the middle of nowhere, sewing for railroad workers. Your father would be appalled." He moved closer, and Catherine forced herself not to flinch back. "But then, your father is dead, isn't he? Heart failure. 6 months ago. Such a tragedy. And with your reputation in ruins, no family to turn to, well, I can see why you felt the need to disappear." Catherine lifted her chin, meeting his gaze directly. "You didn't answer my question. What do you want?" She kept her hands in her lap, hidden in the folds of her skirt where he couldn't see them trembling. Fear was a luxury she couldn't afford right now. She needed to think clearly, to understand what game Marcus was playing and how dangerous it might become. Marcus pulled out the cabin's single chair and sat down without being invited, making himself comfortable like he owned the place, like he owned her. "I want what I've always wanted, Catherine. You, as my wife." He held up a hand when she opened her mouth to refuse. I know. You said no in Boston, multiple times in fact. But that was before. Before your father died. Before the scandal. Before you realized how difficult life can be for a woman alone, without resources or protection. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to what he probably thought was a persuasive tone. "I'm offering you a way out of this miserable existence. Marry me. Return to Boston as Mrs. Marcus Dalton, and all will be forgiven. I'll restore your reputation, give you back the life you lost. All you have to do is say yes." The presumption of it, the sheer arrogance, left Catherine momentarily speechless. Did he truly believe she would marry the man who'd destroyed her life? The man who'd spread vicious lies about her virtue to every society matron in Boston? The man who'd tried to force himself on her more than once, backing off only when she threatened to scream? But looking at Marcus's confident expression, she realized he did believe it. He thought she was desperate enough, broken enough, to accept his so-called generosity. And perhaps the old Catherine, the Catherine Miller who'd lived in that Boston townhouse and believed the world was essentially fair, might have crumbled under such pressure. But Catherine Hayes, who'd survived winter on the frontier and nearly lost her feet to frostbite, who'd learned to sew by lamplight until her fingers bled and accept help from kind strangers without shame, that Catherine was made of sterner stuff. "No," she said simply. "I will never marry you, Marcus. Not if you were the last man on earth. Not if I was starving in a gutter. You're a liar and a manipulator, and I want nothing to do with you." She stood up, her healing feet protesting the sudden movement, but holding steady. "Now get out of my cabin." Marcus's expression darkened, the charming mask slipping to reveal something uglier beneath. You don't seem to understand your position, Catherine. I can destroy you here just as easily as I did in Boston. A few words to the camp manager about your questionable morals, about how you seduced and abandoned your father's business partner, how you're not to be trusted around men. He stood as well, looming over her in the small space. Who do you think they'll believe? A respected businessman from Boston? Or a seamstress with no references and a false name? Catherine's heart hammered in her chest, but she kept her voice level. Is that a threat? She asked. Because if you're threatening me, Marcus, perhaps I should mention to the camp manager that you tracked down a woman who rejected you across half the country, that you followed her to the middle of nowhere to harass her into marriage. I wonder what that says about your character. For a moment, they stood facing each other in tense silence, and Catherine saw rage flicker in Marcus's blue eyes. He wasn't used to being defied. In Boston, his wealth and position had made him untouchable, but they weren't in Boston anymore, and Catherine had learned that desperation could be its own kind of power. She had nothing left to lose. That made her dangerous in ways Marcus hadn't anticipated. Before either of them could speak again, there was another knock at the door. Catherine? You in there? Daniel's voice, familiar and welcome, made relief flood through Catherine's chest. I brought that firewood you asked about. She hadn't asked about firewood, which meant Daniel had invented an excuse to check on her. Whether he'd seen Marcus enter her cabin or simply had impeccable timing, Catherine didn't know and didn't care. She called out, "Come in," and watched Marcus's expression shift from rage to calculation as the door opened and Daniel entered, his arms full of split logs. The railroad worker took in the scene immediately, his brown eyes moving from Catherine's pale face to Marcus's too close position. He set the firewood down by the stove with deliberate slowness, then turned to face Marcus with a stillness that somehow conveyed more menace than any aggressive posture could have. "Didn't know you had company," Daniel said to Catherine, though his gaze never left Marcus. "Should I come back later, or is your guest just leaving?" Marcus recovered his composure quickly, arranging his features into a pleasant smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm Marcus Dalton, an old friend of Miss Hayes from Boston, just passing through the territory on business and thought I'd look her up." He extended his hand toward Daniel, who looked at it for a long moment before shaking it briefly. "Daniel," the railroad worker said. "Foreman here at the camp. Any friend of Catherine's is welcome, of course, though I'm surprised you came all this way in such dangerous weather just to visit. The roads between here and Stone Valley are barely passable right now." There was a challenge in Daniel's tone, politely phrased but unmistakable, and Catherine saw Marcus recognize it. The two men were roughly the same height, but Daniel had at least 30 pounds of muscle on the businessman, and years of hard labor had given him a physical presence that Marcus's expensive tailoring couldn't match. "Well, some friendships are worth the effort," Marcus said smoothly, retrieving his hat from where he'd set it on Catherine's table. "But I can see Miss Hayes is busy, so I'll take my leave. Perhaps we can continue our conversation another time, Catherine? I'm staying at the hotel in Stone Valley for the next few weeks. Business matters to attend to." Catherine didn't respond, just watched as Marcus moved toward the door. He paused there, looking back at her with that calculating expression she remembered so well. "Do think about my offer," he said. "It's a generous one, more generous than you deserve, some might say, given the circumstances." Then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a soft click, leaving Catherine and Daniel alone in the small cabin. The moment Marcus was out of sight, Catherine's legs gave out, and she sank back onto her cot, her whole body trembling with reaction. Daniel was at her side immediately, his hand warm on her shoulder, his voice low with concern. "What did he want? Are you all right? Did he hurt you?" Catherine shook her head, trying to find her voice through the fear and anger churning in her stomach. "He wants to marry me," she managed finally. "Or rather, he wants to control me. It's the same thing to him." She looked up at Daniel, saw the concern in his brown eyes, and felt something in her chest crack open. She was so tired of carrying her secrets alone, so exhausted from the constant vigilance of hiding who she'd been. "He's the reason I left Boston, the reason I changed my name. He was my father's business partner, and when I refused his advances, he destroyed my reputation. Made it impossible for me to find work, to exist in society. I had to leave everything behind and start over." Daniel's jaw tightened, his hand on her shoulder squeezing gently. "And now he's tracked you down. Come all this way to finish what he started." It wasn't a question. Daniel understood immediately, his mind working through the implications. "Catherine, men like that don't give up easily. If he's here, if he's staying in Stone Valley, he's planning something." Catherine nodded, hugging herself against a chill that had nothing to do with the winter cold seeping through the cabin walls. "He threatened to spread lies about me here, to ruin my reputation the way he did in Boston. Told me I should accept his marriage proposal because I have no other options." She laughed bitterly. "He actually thinks I'm desperate enough to marry him, that a life of being controlled by him is better than honest work and freedom." Daniel was quiet for a moment, his hand still on her shoulder, solid and warm, and somehow anchoring. Then he said, "You're not alone this time. Whatever he's planning, whatever he tries to do, you have friends here. People who know your character, who've seen your work and your integrity. Patterson thinks highly of you. The men respect your skills. And I." He paused, his voice dropping lower. "I won't let him hurt you again, Catherine. I promise you that." The fierce protectiveness in Daniel's tone made Catherine's throat tighten with emotion. She'd been alone for so long, fighting her battles by herself, trusting no one. But looking up at Daniel's face, seeing the determination there and the genuine care, she realized she didn't have to be alone anymore. Not if she was brave enough to accept help. Not if she was willing to trust again despite the risk. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know what I did to deserve your kindness, but thank you." Daniel shook his head, a small smile crossing his weathered features. "You don't have to do anything to deserve basic human decency, Catherine. You just have to exist." He moved to her small stove, adding wood and stoking the fire higher. "Why don't I stay here for a bit? Make sure your friend doesn't decide to come back for another conversation. You can tell me about Boston if you want, or we can just sit quiet. Whatever you need." Catherine found herself talking. Once she started, the words poured out like water from a broken dam. She told Daniel about her mother's death when she was 12, how her father had buried himself in his business afterward, and left Catherine to raise herself with only the housekeeper for company. About learning to sew as a way to fill the lonely hours, discovering she had a talent for it. About her father's partnership with Marcus Dalton 5 years ago. How charming Marcus had seemed at first. How attentive. About the way his attention had slowly turned possessive, then aggressive. The unwanted touches. The demands. The assumption that because he was wealthy and handsome, Catherine should be grateful for his interest. "I told my father," Catherine said, staring at her hands folded in her lap. "But he didn't believe me, or didn't want to believe me. Marcus was making him rich, you see. Their business was thriving. My father said I must have misunderstood Marcus's intentions, that I was being dramatic." The old hurt was still there, sharp as a fresh wound. Her own father choosing his business partner over his daughter. So I stopped going to parties where Marcus might be, started refusing invitations, tried to make myself invisible. She looked up at Daniel, who was listening with complete attention, his face grave. But then my father died suddenly, and Marcus showed up at the funeral with a marriage proposal. Said it was what my father would have wanted, that it made financial sense. When I refused, he got angry, started spreading rumors. Told everyone I'd been his mistress, that I'd seduced him, and then broken it off when I thought I could do better. Within 2 weeks, I couldn't get work anywhere in Boston. Families who'd commissioned dresses from me canceled their orders. Women I'd considered friends crossed the street to avoid me. Daniel's hands had curled into fists at some point during her story, his knuckles white with tension. "He should be horsewhipped," he said, his voice rough with anger. "A man who uses his power to destroy a woman's life because she won't submit to him, that's lower than low. That's the act of a coward." Catherine nodded, surprised by the validation. She'd spent so many months wondering if she'd somehow brought the scandal on herself, if she should have handled things differently. Hearing Daniel's straightforward condemnation of Marcus's actions eased something tight in her chest. "I sold everything I owned to buy a train ticket west and enough supplies to get started somewhere new. Changed my name at the first station where no one knew me. Became Catherine Hayes instead of Catherine Miller." She smiled without humor. "I thought I'd left him behind, thought I was safe, but I should have known better. Marcus doesn't let go of things he considers his." Daniel stood and began pacing the small cabin, his movements restless, with barely contained fury. "We need to tell Patterson what's happening. Get ahead of whatever lies Marcus might spread. And we need to make sure you're not alone with him again. No more private visits, no matter what excuse he gives." He stopped pacing and looked at Catherine directly. "But more than that, we need to figure out what he's really doing here. Because I don't believe he came all this way just to propose again. There's something else, some angle we're not seeing yet." Catherine considered that, her mind working through the implications. Daniel was right. Marcus was many things, but he wasn't sentimental. He wouldn't waste weeks of his time and considerable money on travel to a remote Idaho Territory railroad camp just to pursue a woman who'd already rejected him multiple times. There had to be another reason. "Business," Marcus had said. "Business matters to attend to." What kind of business would bring a Boston investor to a railroad camp in winter? Catherine asked slowly. "Is there something valuable here? Something worth his attention?" Daniel's eyes widened slightly as understanding dawned. "The railroad itself," he said. "We're building through territory that's going to be worth a fortune once the line is complete. Land values, mineral rights, supply contracts." He ran a hand through his sandy hair, making it stand up in spikes. "There have been rumors for weeks that outside investors have been buying up land along the planned route, trying to corner the market before the railroad brings in settlers and businesses. Patterson's been complaining about it. said it drives up costs and makes everything harder. And Marcus specializes in exactly that kind of investment, Catherine said, pieces clicking together in her mind. Taking something valuable that other people haven't recognized yet and exploiting it for maximum profit. He did it with my father's business. Came in as a partner, maneuvered until he controlled everything, then pushed my father out of major decisions. A chill ran down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. If he's here buying land along the railroad route, that means he has information about where the line is going. Inside information. Daniel swore under his breath, then apologized immediately. Sorry, but if he's got someone in the company feeding him root information, that's a serious problem. The railroad companies guard those plans carefully for exactly this reason. Someone's betraying the company for money, and Marcus is profiting from it. He looked at Catherine with grudging respect. You're smart, figuring that out so fast. Catherine felt heat rise in her cheeks at the compliment, but pushed past it to focus on the larger problem. The question is, does my presence here complicate his plans? Is that why he's so eager to marry me or discredit me? Because I might expose what he's doing? She thought about Marcus's expression when he'd made his threats. The calculation in his blue eyes. He doesn't know what I might have told people here about him. Doesn't know if I've already warned anyone that he's not to be trusted. I'm a variable he can't control, and Marcus hates variables. Daniel nodded slowly, his mind clearly working through scenarios. Which means he'll try to neutralize you one way or another, either by getting you to marry him, which would give him legal control over you and anything you might say, or by destroying your credibility here so no one believes you if you do speak up. He met her gaze, his brown eyes serious. We need to be very careful, Catherine. Men like Marcus Dalton don't play fair, and they don't lose gracefully. If he feels cornered, there's no telling what he might do. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Catherine knew Daniel was right, but part of her rebelled against the idea of living in fear again. She'd spent too many months looking over her shoulder in Boston, jumping at shadows, afraid of every footstep behind her. She wouldn't do that again. Wouldn't let Marcus turn her into a frightened creature, hiding in the dark. Then we fight, she said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. We figure out what he's planning, and we expose it. We don't let him win. She stood up from the cot, ignoring the protest from her still healing feet. I'm done running, Daniel. Done hiding. If Marcus Dalton wants a fight, then that's what he'll get. Daniel studied her for a long moment, and Catherine saw approval dawn in his expression. All right then, he said. We fight, but we do it smart, and we do it together. He held out his hand and Catherine took it, his palm warm and calloused and solid against hers. Partners? Partners, Catherine agreed, and felt something shift in her chest. She wasn't alone anymore. She had an ally, maybe even a friend. And together, perhaps they could beat Marcus at his own game. Over the following days, Catherine and Daniel became a team in ways that surprised them both. Daniel made discreet inquiries among the railroad workers about any strangers who'd been asking questions or showing unusual interest in company plans. Catherine paid attention to gossip among the few women in camp, listening for any mention of land deals or outside investors. They met in Catherine's cabin each evening after the workday ended, Daniel bringing firewood as his excuse, and compared notes while Catherine continued her sewing. It felt natural, this partnership. Daniel would sit by her stove, occasionally adding wood to keep the fire high, and they'd talk through everything they'd learned. Sometimes their conversations drifted away from Marcus and the railroad into more personal territory. Daniel told her about growing up on his family's farm in Ohio, how he'd left to find adventure and ended up on the railroad because he liked the idea of building something that would last beyond his lifetime. Catherine told him about her mother, how she'd been the daughter of immigrants who'd worked as a seamstress and passed her skills down to her daughter before consumption took her too young. "My father never understood why I wanted to sew," Catherine said one evening, her needle moving in steady rhythm through the heavy canvas of a coat. "He thought it was beneath me, that I should focus on finding a wealthy husband instead of developing a trade. But my mother said a woman should always have something that's hers, some skill that no one can take away. She was right. When everything else was gone, I still had my sewing. It saved my life." Daniel watched her work, his gaze following the precise movements of her hands. "You're an artist," he said. "The way you reinforce a seam, add a patch so it looks intentional instead of makeshift. That takes real skill. Your mother would be proud." The words, simple and sincere, made Catherine's throat tighten with emotion. No one had said anything like that to her in so long. Her father had tolerated her sewing as a hobby. Marcus had sneered at it as beneath a woman of her station. But Daniel saw the artistry in it, the value. He respected her work the way he'd respect any craftsman's skill. It meant more than he probably realized. It was during one of these evening meetings, nearly 2 weeks after Marcus's first visit, that Daniel arrived with news that changed everything. His expression was grim as he entered Catherine's cabin, and he didn't bother with his usual greeting before saying, "Patterson got a letter today from the main office. They're sending an auditor to investigate suspected route information leaks. Someone's been buying land along the planned expansion before the company announces it publicly, which means someone inside is selling information." Catherine set down her sewing, her heart rate picking up. "Does Patterson know it's Marcus?" Daniel shook his head, pulling off his heavy coat and hanging it by the door. "Not yet. The letter didn't name anyone specifically. But I told Patterson about your friend from Boston. Suggested he might want to look into what business brings an investor all the way out here in winter." He met her gaze. "Patterson's sharp. He'll put it together. But the question is, what will Marcus do when he realizes he's under investigation?" Catherine's mind raced through possibilities. None of them good. Marcus was most dangerous when cornered. She knew that from experience. If he thought his business schemes were about to be exposed, he'd strike out at anyone he perceived as a threat. And Catherine, who knew his character and his methods, who'd already refused to be controlled by him, she'd be at the top of that list. "He'll come after me," she said quietly. "Try to force me into marriage before the investigation reaches him, or destroy my credibility so thoroughly that nothing I say about him will be believed. Maybe both." Daniel's jaw tightened, that protective fury Catherine was starting to recognize flickering in his brown eyes. "Then we don't give him the chance. You don't go anywhere alone until this is resolved. I'll talk to Patterson about assigning you a workspace in the main building instead of here in the women's quarters. More people around, harder for Marcus to corner you." He hesitated, then added, "And I can move my things to the cabin next door, just for extra security. So you're not isolated out here." The offer was practical, sensible even, but Catherine felt heat rise in her cheeks anyway. Having Daniel that close, just a thin wall away every night, that felt like something more than simple protection. It felt like a statement, a claiming of sorts, and she didn't know how she felt about that. Grateful, certainly. but also aware of how much she'd come to depend on his presence, to look forward to their evening meetings. The way his smile made something warm unfold in her chest, the solid comfort of his voice in the lamplight. She was developing feelings for Daniel, she realized with a start. Real feelings that went beyond gratitude or friendship. And that was dangerous in its own way. "You don't have to do that," Catherine said, trying to keep her voice level. "I'm sure you have better things to do than guard a seamstress from her past mistakes." Daniel crossed the small cabin in 2 strides, his movements swift and determined, and before Catherine could react, he'd taken her hands in his. His palms were warm, rough with calluses, and the touch sent electricity racing up her arms. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low and intense. "None of this is your mistake. You didn't do anything wrong. Marcus Dalton is a predator who targeted you, and what happened in Boston is on him, not you. You understand? You have nothing to be ashamed of." Catherine stared up at him, struck by the fierce conviction in his expression, and felt something inside her shift and settle. She'd been carrying guilt for so long, wondering what she could have done differently, how she might have prevented the scandal. But Daniel was right. She'd done nothing wrong. She'd refused an unwanted marriage proposal. She'd told the truth about Marcus's behavior. She'd fled rather than submit to his control. Those weren't mistakes. Those were acts of courage. "Thank you," she whispered, her hands tightening around his. "For seeing that. For believing me." Daniel's expression softened, his thumb rubbing gentle circles on the back of her hand. "I'll always believe you, Catherine. Always." The words hung in the air between them, laden with meaning that went beyond the immediate crisis. This wasn't just about Marcus anymore, Catherine realized. Something real was growing between her and Daniel. Something that felt like it might be worth the risk of trusting again. But before either of them could say more, there was a sharp knock at the door that made them both jump. Daniel released her hands reluctantly and moved to answer the door, positioning himself between Catherine and whoever waited outside. It was one of the younger workers, the same boy who delivered her first batch of mending, and his eyes were wide with urgency. "Foreman, Mr. Patterson needs you at the main office right away. Says it's important. And Miss Hayes too, if she's available." Catherine and Daniel exchanged glances, a wordless conversation passing between them in that look. Whatever this was, it involved Marcus. It had to. Daniel nodded to the boy and said, "Tell Patterson we'll be there in 5 minutes." As soon as the door closed, he turned back to Catherine. "You don't have to do this if you're not ready. I can go alone, find out what's happening." But Catherine was already reaching for her heavy shawl, wrapping it around her shoulders against the brutal cold outside. "No," she said firmly. "We do this together. Partners. Remember?" She met his gaze, drew strength from the solid presence of him. "Whatever Marcus has done, whatever he's planning, I won't hide from it anymore." Daniel smiled, and the pride in that expression warmed Catherine more than any fire could. "That's my girl," he said, then immediately looked flustered, like he hadn't meant to say it aloud. But Catherine found herself smiling back, despite the fear churning in her stomach, despite the uncertainty of what they were about to face. My girl. She liked the sound of that more than she probably should. Together, they stepped out into the frigid night, the wind cutting through their clothes like knives, and made their way toward the main office where Patterson waited. The camp was quiet, most workers already in their bunks trying to stay warm, and their footsteps crunched loud in the packed snow. Above them, stars blazed cold and distant in a sky so clear it hurt to look at. Catherine shivered and immediately felt Daniel's arm come around her shoulders, pulling her close to share warmth. It was practical, she told herself. Just two people trying to survive the brutal Idaho Territory winter. But the way her heart hammered in her chest suggested her body knew better. Patterson's office was warm and well lit, the stove in the corner radiating heat that made Catherine's cheeks sting as she entered. The camp manager was behind his desk with papers spread before him, and his expression was grim. But he wasn't alone. Sitting in one of the chairs before the desk, looking perfectly composed and infuriatingly confident, was Marcus Dalton. He smiled when Catherine and Daniel entered, that calculated smile she'd learned to hate, and rose to his feet with exaggerated courtesy. "Ah, Miss Hayes," Marcus said smoothly. "How convenient. I was just discussing you with Mr. Patterson here, explaining some concerns I have about your character and fitness for employment in this camp." He turned to Patterson. "As I was saying, Catherine and I knew each other quite well in Boston. I'm afraid she left under something of a cloud. Accusations of theft from her employer, improper relations with several gentlemen, that sort of thing. I felt it my duty as someone familiar with her history to warn you before her presence here caused problems." Catherine felt the blood drain from her face, but before she could speak, Daniel stepped forward, his voice cold as the winter night. "That's interesting, Mr. Dalton, because the Catherine I know is honest, hardworking, and skilled at her trade. Strange how your version of events is so different from what I've observed with my own eyes these past weeks." End quote. Marcus's smile didn't waver, but his eyes hardened slightly. "With respect, Mr. Daniel, you've known Miss Hayes for less than a month. I knew her for years in Boston. I think my assessment of her character carries somewhat more weight." He looked at Patterson. "I understand you've given her employment here, and I commend your charitable instincts, but I strongly advise." End quote. "Mr. Dalton," Patterson interrupted, his gravelly voice cutting through Marcus's smooth speech like a saw through wood. "Before you continue, there's something you should know. I received some interesting correspondence this morning from the railroad company's main office. It seems they've become aware of unauthorized information leaks regarding our expansion routes. Someone has been selling route plans to outside investors, allowing those investors to buy up land before the railroad announces its intentions, thereby driving up costs significantly for the company." Patterson leaned back in his chair, his eyes hard on Marcus. "The company has launched a full investigation. They're very interested in speaking with anyone who's made suspicious land purchases along our planned routes, especially investors from back east who just happen to be in the territory right now." The silence that followed was absolute. Catherine watched Marcus's face, saw the moment he understood that his scheme had been discovered, saw the fury flash in his blue eyes before he locked it down behind that perfect society mask. But Patterson wasn't finished. "Now, Mr. Dalton, I'm just a camp manager. I don't know anything about high finance or land speculation. But I do know people, and I know when someone's trying to manipulate me. So here's what I think happened." Patterson stood up, his considerable bulk suddenly intimidating despite his age. "I think you've been buying land along our route using inside information you shouldn't have. I think Miss Hayes here represents a threat to you, because she knows your character and might speak up about your methods if asked. And I think you came here tonight to preemptively destroy her credibility, so that nothing she says about you will be taken seriously when the investigators come calling. He crossed his arms. How am I doing so far? Marcus's composure cracked, just slightly, and Catherine felt a fierce satisfaction at seeing it. That's a very creative story, Mr. Patterson, Marcus said. His voice clipped now, the smooth charm abandoned. But you have no proof of any wrongdoing on my part. I'm a legitimate businessman conducting legitimate transactions. If I chose to invest in Idaho Territory land, that's my right. And as for Miss Hayes, everything I said about her reputation in Boston is verifiable. She left under suspicious circumstances after her father's death. She changed her name. These are facts, not slander. Funny thing about facts, Daniel said, and Catherine heard steel in his voice she'd never heard before. They matter less than character in a place like this, and Catherine's character is solid. She's proven that in her work and her conduct. Whereas you, Mr. Dalton, you come out here in the dead of winter, claiming to be just passing through, but you're really trying to cover your tracks. Trying to silence someone who knows you're not what you pretend to be. That doesn't speak well to your character at all. Marcus stood abruptly, his chair scraping loud against the wooden floor. I don't have to listen to accusations from railroad laborers, he said, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. Mr. Patterson, if you choose to employ a woman of questionable virtue, that's your business. But don't expect me to stay silent when that decision affects the reputation of this camp. He grabbed his hat from Patterson's desk. I'll be in Stone Valley for another week, settling my affairs. After that, I'll return to Boston. I suggest you consider carefully who you trust, Mr. Patterson. Miss Hayes is very good at playing the victim, but I assure you, she's far more calculating than she appears. With that, Marcus strode from the office, slamming the door behind him hard enough to rattle the windows. In the silence that followed his departure, Catherine found she could breathe again, though her hands were shaking where she'd clenched them in her skirts. Daniel's hand found hers immediately, squeezing gently, and she held on tight, grateful for the anchor. Patterson sank back into his chair and rubbed his face tiredly. Well, that was enlightening, he said. Though I can't say I'm surprised. Man was too smooth, too eager to discredit you, Miss Hayes. Made me suspicious from the start. He looked at Catherine with something that might have been sympathy. I'm sorry you had to go through that. But for what it's worth, I didn't believe a word he said. Your work speaks for itself, and Daniel's never steered me wrong about someone's character. Catherine felt tears prick at her eyes, but she blinked them back fiercely. She wouldn't cry, not now, not when she'd just won a small victory. Thank you, she managed, for believing me, for standing up to him. Patterson waved off the thanks gruffly. Just did what was right. Now, about this investigation. The company auditors will be here in about 2 weeks, weather permitting. They'll want to interview everyone, including you, Miss Hayes, since you have history with Dalton. You willing to tell them what you know about his character and methods? Catherine looked at Daniel, saw the support in his brown eyes, and nodded. Yes, she said firmly. I'll tell them everything. About Boston, about what he did to me and my father's business, about how he operates. If it helps stop him from hurting anyone else, then it's worth it. Patterson nodded with satisfaction. Good. In the meantime, I want you taking precautions. Dalton struck me as a man who doesn't take defeat well, and he's got a week before he leaves the territory. That's plenty of time for him to cause trouble. He looked at Daniel. I'm officially assigning you to keep an eye on Miss Hayes. Make sure she's not caught alone anywhere, especially off camp property. Consider it part of your foreman duties. Daniel's lips quirked in a slight smile. Already planned on it, sir. As they left Patterson's office and stepped back into the frigid night, Catherine felt strangely light despite everything. Marcus had tried to destroy her reputation again, and it hadn't worked. Patterson believed her. Daniel stood by her. For the first time since Boston, she had allies. People who saw through Marcus's manipulations and chose to trust her instead. It was a heady feeling, this validation, and it made her realize how much she'd been craving it. How much she'd needed someone to say, I believe you, and mean it. That could have gone worse, Daniel said as they walked back toward the women's quarters, his arm around her shoulders again for warmth. The contact felt natural now, comfortable, and Catherine let herself lean into him slightly. Patterson's a good man. Fair. He won't let Marcus push him around. Catherine nodded, watching their breath form clouds in the frozen air. But Marcus isn't done. You know that, right? He'll do something before he leaves. Something to punish me for not submitting. For costing him his scheme. He's vindictive that way. She shivered, and not just from the cold. I know how he thinks, Daniel. He won't let this go unanswered. Daniel's arm tightened around her protectively. Then we'll be ready for whatever he tries. You're not alone in this anymore, Catherine. Remember that. They'd reached her cabin, and he paused at the door, his face serious in the starlight. I meant what I said earlier, about moving to the cabin next door. I know it's not entirely proper, but... Do it, Catherine interrupted. Please, I'll sleep better knowing you're close. She met his gaze directly, saw surprise, and something warmer flicker in his brown eyes. I trust you, Daniel. That's not something I say lightly anymore. But it's true. I trust you. Daniel's expression softened into something that made Catherine's heart stutter in her chest. I'll start moving my things tomorrow, he said quietly. And Catherine, I trust you too, more than I've trusted anyone in a long time. He hesitated, then added, I know this isn't the best time, with everything that's happening, but I want you to know that my reasons for helping you, they're not entirely selfless anymore. I care about what happens to you, more than I probably should. The admission hung between them, crystallizing in the frozen air like their breath, and Catherine felt her pulse quicken. She'd known, of course, had felt the same pull toward him that he was now confessing to feeling toward her, but hearing him say it out loud made it real in a way that was both thrilling and terrifying. I care too, she whispered. More than I thought I could after Boston. You make me want to trust again, Daniel. Want to believe that good men exist. Daniel reached up slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, and cupped her face gently in his calloused hand. His thumb brushed across her cheekbone, and Catherine's eyes fluttered closed at the tenderness of the touch. We'll get through this, he promised. Marcus, the investigation, all of it, and then, when it's over, maybe we can figure out what this is between us. Take our time, do it right. Would you like that? Catherine opened her eyes and saw everything she needed to know in his expression. Patience, respect, genuine affection. This was a man who wouldn't push, wouldn't demand more than she was ready to give. A man who saw her as an equal partner, not a possession to be claimed. "I would like that very much," she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. Daniel smiled, that rare full smile that transformed his weather-worn face into something beautiful, and leaned forward to press a gentle kiss to her forehead. Just a brush of lips against skin, chaste and sweet, and somehow more intimate than anything Catherine had experienced before. Then he stepped back, still smiling. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be a long day." Catherine watched him walk away toward his own cabin, then slipped inside her small space and closed the door. She leaned against it, her hand pressed to her forehead where she could still feel the ghost of his kiss, and let herself smile. Despite Marcus, despite the danger still lurking, despite everything, she felt hopeful for the first time in months, maybe even happy. And that was worth fighting for. The next 3 days passed in relative calm, though Catherine remained constantly aware of the threat hanging over them like a sword. Marcus didn't make any more appearances at the camp, though Daniel heard from workers who'd gone to Stone Valley that the businessman was still at the hotel, conducting meetings with various people. What kind of meetings? No one knew. But it made everyone nervous. Patterson increased security around the camp, and true to his word, Daniel moved his belongings into the cabin next door to Catherine's. Having him so close should have felt awkward, but instead, it was comforting. She'd hear him moving around in the evening, the sound of his door opening and closing, and no, she wasn't alone. They fell into a routine. Daniel would come to her cabin after the day's work was done, always with some plausible excuse. More firewood, a message from Patterson, a question about his coat that needed mending. Catherine would make coffee on her small stove, and they'd sit together in the lamplight, talking about everything and nothing. He told her about his brother back in Ohio, how they'd been close as boys but had grown apart when Daniel left for the railroad. She told him about her mother's family, Irish immigrants who'd come to Boston with nothing and built a life through sheer determination and hard work. Sometimes they'd sit in comfortable silence, Catherine sewing, while Daniel read from a book of poetry he kept in his cabin, his deep voice turning the words into something musical. It was during one of these quiet evenings that Catherine realized she was falling in love with him. The thought struck her suddenly as she watched him read, the lamplight catching the gold in his sandy hair, his face relaxed and peaceful. She was falling in love with this gentle, strong man who'd saved her life and then stayed to save her heart. The realization should have terrified her. Love had brought her nothing but pain before. Her love for her father had blinded her to his weaknesses until it was too late. Her trust in Boston society had left her vulnerable to Marcus's manipulations. But loving Daniel felt different. Safer somehow, though she knew that was probably an illusion. Love was never truly safe. Daniel looked up from his book and caught her staring. "What?" he asked, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Do I have something on my face?" Catherine shook her head, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. "No. I was just thinking how different this is from Boston. How different you are from the men I knew there." She set down her sewing, suddenly needing to say what was on her heart. In Boston, men like Marcus saw women as ornaments or possessions, something to be acquired and displayed. But you see me as a person, an equal. You respect my work, my opinions, my choices. Do you know how rare that is? Daniel set his book aside, his expression turning serious. It shouldn't be rare. It should be basic human decency. You're intelligent, talented, capable. Why wouldn't I respect you? He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his brown eyes intent on her face. Catherine, I need you to understand something. What Marcus did to you, the way he treated you, that says everything about him and nothing about you. You didn't deserve that treatment. No woman does. And any man who can't see your worth, who tries to diminish you or control you, that man isn't worthy of your time. Tears pricked at Catherine's eyes despite her best efforts to hold them back. She'd needed to hear those words more than she'd realized. Needed someone to say clearly and without reservation that she wasn't to blame for Marcus's actions. Thank you, she whispered. I know I've said it before, but thank you for seeing me, for believing me, for just being you. Daniel crossed the small space between them and knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. You don't have to thank me for treating you the way you deserve to be treated, he said gently. That should be a given, not a gift. He paused, seeming to gather his courage. But since we're being honest, I want to tell you something. These past weeks, getting to know you, seeing your strength and your kindness and your courage, it's changed something in me. Made me realize what I was missing, what I've been looking for without knowing it. I know the timing is complicated, and I know you're still healing from what Marcus did. But when this is all over, when you're free of him completely, I'd like to court you properly. If you'll have me. Catherine's heart felt like it might burst from her chest. Daniel wasn't just offering comfort or protection. He was offering himself, his future, a real chance at something lasting. And despite everything she'd been through, despite all the reasons she should be cautious and guarded, she found herself wanting to say yes, wanting to take that risk. I'd like that, she said, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. I'd like that very much. But Daniel, you should know that I come with complications. Marcus isn't the only shadow from my past. I have no family, no social connections, no dowry. I'm just a seamstress with a scandalous history and a new name. If people in your life knew about Boston, about the rumors... Stop, Daniel interrupted gently but firmly. I don't care about any of that. I don't care about dowries or social connections or what people might say. I care about you. The woman who nearly froze to death rather than give up on a new start. The woman who stands up to men like Marcus even when she's terrified. The woman who creates beauty with needle and thread and brings dignity to honest work. He squeezed her hands. That's who you are, Catherine. Not the lies Marcus spread or the scandal he created. You. And you're more than enough. Catherine couldn't help herself. She leaned forward and kissed him. Just a brief press of lips to lips, gentle and chaste, but full of promise. Daniel froze for a heartbeat, surprised, then kissed her back with a tenderness that made her ache. It lasted only a moment before they both pulled back, but it changed everything. Sealed something between them that had been building since that first night when he'd warmed her frozen feet by the fire. Well, Daniel said, his voice slightly rough. That was unexpected. Catherine laughed, the sound bright and genuine. Good unexpected or bad unexpected? Very good unexpected, Daniel assured her, his eyes crinkling with a smile. Though, we should probably take this slow. Make sure we're thinking clearly and not just caught up in the drama of everything happening with Marcus. Catherine nodded, appreciating his caution even as part of her wanted to throw it aside. Slow is good. Slow is smart. She smiled at him. Though I reserve the right to kiss you again when the mood strikes. Daniel grinned. I can live with that. But their tentative happiness was shattered 2 days later, when Catherine woke to find a note shoved under her cabin door. The paper was expensive, the handwriting elegant and familiar. Marcus's hand. She picked it up with trembling fingers and read, Catherine, you've made a grave mistake in spurning my offers and turning Patterson against me. I came here with honest intentions, willing to overlook your past indiscretions and give you another chance at a respectable life. But you've chosen to align yourself with railroad laborers and spread lies about my character instead. So be it. I hope your new friends will stand by you when the truth comes out. And it will come out. I've made sure of that. Consider this your final warning. You can still save yourself if you come to Stone Valley today and accept my proposal. Otherwise, the consequences will be entirely on your head. MD. Catherine's hands shook as she finished reading, her mind racing through implications. What did Marcus mean by consequences? What truth was he threatening to reveal? She'd told Daniel and Patterson everything relevant about Boston. There were no secrets left for Marcus to expose, unless he planned to fabricate new lies. And if he was fabricating something, what could it be? What would hurt her most effectively? She was still staring at the note when Daniel knocked and entered, already dressed for the day's work. He took one look at her face and crossed to her immediately. What happened? What's wrong? Catherine handed him the note wordlessly and watched his expression darken as he read. That bastard, Daniel muttered. He's trying to intimidate you into submission, threatening some kind of retaliation if you don't go to him. He looked up at her. You're not going, of course. Of course not, Catherine agreed. But Daniel, what if he's planning something terrible? What if he's going to hurt someone to get to me? Marcus is capable of anything when he feels crossed. Daniel set the note aside and took her shoulders gently. Listen to me. Marcus is a bully and a manipulator, but his power is all illusion. He counts on people being afraid of what he might do. But we're not going to give him that power over us. He pulled her into his arms, holding her close. Whatever he's planning, we'll face it together. And we'll win, Catherine. Men like Marcus always lose in the end because they underestimate people they consider beneath them. He underestimates you. He underestimates what we'll do to protect each other. Catherine let herself lean into Daniel's strength for a moment, drawing comfort from the solid warmth of him. Then she pulled back and straightened her spine. You're right. I won't let him scare me into giving up. She looked at the note again, reading between the lines. But I think we should show this to Patterson. Whatever Marcus is planning, Patterson should know about it. They went to find the camp manager immediately, and Patterson's face turned grim as he read Marcus's threat. This is escalating faster than I'd like, he admitted. The auditors aren't due for another 10 days, which gives Dalton time to cause real damage if he's desperate enough. He looked at Catherine. I'm doubling the watch on the women's quarters in the main camp. No one comes or goes without being checked. And Miss Hayes, I'm sorry. but I need to ask you not to leave camp property until Dalton has left the territory. It's for your own safety." Catherine nodded, understanding even as the restriction chafed. She'd been looking forward to the supply wagon trip to Stone Valley next week. A chance to see something beyond the camp's boundaries. But if staying close to camp meant staying safe from Marcus, then that's what she'd do. "I understand," she said. "I'll stay here." Patterson dismissed them with promises to increase security, and Catherine returned to her cabin to begin the day's sewing. But she couldn't focus on her work, her mind spinning through scenarios of what Marcus might do. The morning dragged by slowly, every unexpected sound making her jump. When lunchtime came, Daniel appeared at her door with food from the camp kitchen and his own worried expression. They ate together in tense silence, both aware they were waiting for something to happen, but not knowing what form it would take. The blow came that evening, just as the sun was setting and the temperature was dropping toward the brutal lows of deep winter night. Catherine heard shouting from the direction of the main office and went to her cabin door to investigate. Other workers were doing the same, drawn by the commotion. She saw Patterson emerge from his office with several other men, their expressions grim, and her heart sank. Something had happened. Something bad. Daniel appeared at her side almost immediately, and together they made their way toward the growing crowd. Patterson spotted them and waved them over, his face set in harsh lines. "There's been an incident in Stone Valley," he said without preamble. "A fire at the general store. Started late this afternoon, spread fast. They managed to contain it before it took out the whole building, but there's significant damage." He looked at Catherine directly. "The store owner says he saw someone matching Dalton's description near the building just before the fire started. Can't prove anything, but the timing is suspicious." Catherine felt ice flood through her veins. He's burning things down now? Risking innocent people's lives? She couldn't believe even Marcus would go that far. But looking at Patterson's expression, she knew it was true. "It gets worse," Patterson continued. "The fire chief found evidence of accelerant. This wasn't an accident. Someone set it deliberately." He paused, and there was a message painted on the wall of the building next door. Said, "Liars pay the price." Sound familiar to anyone? Catherine swayed slightly, and Daniel's arm came around her immediately, holding her steady. Marcus was sending a message, demonstrating what he was capable of if Catherine didn't submit to his demands. The general store today. But what about tomorrow? Who else would suffer because she dared to stand up to him? "This is my fault," she whispered. "He's doing this to punish me." "No," Daniel said firmly. "This is Marcus Dalton's fault. He's the one choosing violence and destruction. You didn't make him do this, Catherine. He's responsible for his own actions." But Catherine could see the worry in Daniel's eyes, the fear that Marcus's escalation meant worse things were coming. Patterson clearly shared that concern because he said, "I've sent word to the territorial marshal. This has gone beyond a simple business dispute. We're talking about arson now, about endangering lives. Dalton's crossed a line he can't come back from." He looked between Catherine and Daniel. "In the meantime, I want you both staying in sight of others at all times. No exceptions. Dalton's proven he's willing to hurt people to get what he wants, and I won't have anyone else endangered on my watch." The next 2 days were tense beyond bearing. Word came from Stone Valley that Marcus had left the hotel the morning after the fire, his whereabouts now unknown. The territorial marshal was searching for him, But in the vast expanse of Idaho Territory in winter, a man could disappear easily if he wanted to. Patterson posted guards around the camp perimeter and had all the workers sleeping in shifts, so there were always people awake and watching. No one relaxed. Everyone knew Marcus was still out there somewhere, nursing his wounded pride and planning his next move. Catherine found herself unable to sew, her hands too unsteady to manage the delicate work. Daniel stayed with her constantly, only leaving for essential duties and always ensuring someone else was nearby when he had to go. They barely slept, both listening for sounds of danger in the night. The strain was wearing on them, wearing on everyone. The camp felt like a place under siege, tense and watchful and afraid. On the third day after the fire, a snowstorm rolled in from the north, the kind of blizzard that buried everything under feet of new snow and made travel impossible. The wind howled like something alive and angry, battering the camp buildings with relentless fury. Workers huddled in their cabins, burning through firewood at an alarming rate to stay warm. Catherine sat by her stove with Daniel beside her, both of them staring at the walls and trying not to think about what might be happening outside in that white chaos. At least the storm means Marcus can't move around easily, Daniel said, trying to find something positive in the situation. If he's out there somewhere, he's probably holed up waiting it out same as we are. Catherine nodded, but something nagged at her mind. A memory of Marcus in Boston, the way he'd once bragged about his ruthlessness in business. "I always strike when my opponents least expect it," he'd said. "When they think they're safe, that's when they're most vulnerable." And when would the camp be most vulnerable? When everyone was focused inward on staying warm and alive during a blizzard. When guards might relax their vigilance, because surely no one would be crazy enough to attack during such a storm. "Daniel," Catherine said slowly, a terrible suspicion forming. "What if the storm isn't stopping him? What if he's using it as cover?" Daniel's eyes widened as he understood what she was suggesting. To do what? Attack the camp during a blizzard? That's insane. Exactly, Catherine said. It's so insane that no one would expect it. And Marcus is smart enough to know that. Smart enough to use our assumptions against us. She stood up, sudden urgency flooding through her. We need to warn Patterson. Need to make sure the guards are still watching, despite the weather. They bundled up against the cold and fought their way through the blinding snow to Patterson's office. The camp manager listened to Catherine's concerns with a frown, but he didn't dismiss them. "You might be right," he admitted. "Dalton's already proven he's willing to take risks, and a man desperate enough to commit arson is desperate enough for anything." He called for his senior workers, including the men assigned to guard duty, and within minutes, they were organizing additional patrols despite the brutal weather. Double checks on all the camp buildings, especially the supply depot and the stables where they kept the horses and mules essential for their work. Extra men watching the perimeter, looking for any sign of movement in the snow. They were none too soon. Less than an hour after the extra patrols went out, one of the guards came running back through the snow, his face white with more than cold. "Fire!" he shouted. "The supply depot's on fire!" Everyone mobilized immediately, grabbing whatever they could use to fight the flames. Catherine stayed back as ordered, watching from her cabin window as men formed bucket brigades despite the blizzard, passing water and snow in desperate attempts to contain the fire before it spread to other buildings. The flames were visible even through the heavy snow, orange and angry against the white chaos. And somewhere out there, Catherine knew, Marcus Dalton was watching. enjoying the destruction he'd caused, reveling in the fear and chaos. The fight to save the supply depot took hours. By the time the flames were finally extinguished, half the building was destroyed and countless supplies lost. Food, tools, equipment, winter gear that couldn't easily be replaced until spring. The damage was catastrophic, potentially camp-ending. Without adequate supplies, the railroad work would have to halt. The workers would be sent away. Everything would shut down until warmer weather allowed them to rebuild and restock. And that meant delays, lost contracts, financial ruin for the company. Marcus had struck at the heart of the railroad operation, doing maximum damage with a single act of sabotage. Patterson stood in the ruins of the supply depot the next morning, his face haggard with exhaustion and defeat. "We can't sustain this," he said to Daniel and the other foreman. "If Dalton keeps attacking us, keeps destroying our resources, we'll have to abandon the camp until spring. The company can't afford these losses." He looked at Catherine, who'd insisted on being present for the meeting. "I'm sorry, Miss Hayes, but I think you should leave the territory. Go somewhere Dalton can't find you. Because as long as you're here, he's going to keep targeting us to get to you." Catherine felt those words like a physical blow. Leave. Run again. Let Marcus win by driving her away from the first place that had felt like home in months. Let him destroy the camp and hurt these people who'd shown her kindness just because she dared to refuse him, every fiber of her being rebelled against it. But looking at the exhaustion on the faces around her, the fear in the workers' eyes, she knew Patterson was right. Her presence here was endangering everyone. Marcus would keep escalating until he got what he wanted. And what he wanted was her submission or her exile. Those were the only two options he'd accept. "No," Daniel said before Catherine could respond. "She's not leaving. That's exactly what Dalton wants, to isolate her and make her vulnerable. If she leaves camp, he'll follow her, and then she'll be completely at his mercy." He looked at Patterson. There has to be another way, some way to protect the camp and keep Catherine safe. "The marshal is looking for him," Patterson said. "But until he's caught, we're sitting targets. And I can't risk more lives, Daniel. I can't risk the whole camp operation." He turned to Catherine with sympathy in his eyes. "I know it's not fair, Miss Hayes. None of this is fair. But sometimes we have to make hard choices for the greater good." Catherine felt tears threaten but forced them back. She wouldn't cry, wouldn't give Marcus that satisfaction, even if he wasn't there to see it. She'd survived losing everything once before. She could do it again. "When should I leave?" she asked, proud of how steady her voice sounded. "No," Daniel repeated, more forcefully this time. "I won't let this happen. Catherine stays." He looked around at the assembled men. "How many of you know Miss Hayes? Know her work, her character? She's been nothing but honest and hard-working since she got here. She's mended your clothes, made winter gear that's kept you warm, asked for nothing but fair pay and respect. And now you're going to drive her away because some bastard from Boston is terrorizing us?" His voice rang with conviction. "That's not right. That's not what we do here. We take care of our own." There was a murmur of agreement from some of the men, and Catherine felt her throat tighten with emotion. Daniel was fighting for her, putting his own reputation on the line to defend her. It was more than she dared hope for, more than she felt she deserved. But Patterson was shaking his head. I appreciate the sentiment, Daniel, but this isn't about character or what's fair. It's about survival. The camp can't withstand many more attacks like last night. Then we stop Dalton, Daniel said flatly. We find him, and we end this. He looked at Catherine. You know him better than anyone. Where would he be hiding? Where would he go to wait us out? Catherine thought hard, trying to think like Marcus. He wouldn't stay in Stone Valley now that people knew he was suspected of arson. Too visible. Too easy for the marshal to find. But he wouldn't go far either. Not when his target was here at the camp. He'd want to stay close enough to strike again when the opportunity arose. Somewhere with shelter from the storm. Somewhere he could watch the camp without being seen. There are old mining cabins up in the hills east of here, she said slowly, remembering stories some of the workers had told. Abandoned years ago, but still standing. Someone could hide there, wait out the weather, keep watch on the camp from a distance. Patterson's eyes sharpened with interest. The Silver Creek claims. You're right. There's a whole cluster of old cabins up there. Good shelter, decent sight lines to the camp. He looked at Daniel. You thinking what I'm thinking? Daniel nodded grimly. We go find him. Bring him back to face justice. End this before he can do more damage. It's a 2-day ride up into those hills, even in good weather, Patterson warned. In this snow, it could take twice that. And if you're wrong about where he is, you could die of exposure looking for him. Are you willing to take that risk? Yes, Daniel said without hesitation. He looked at Catherine. I'm willing. Catherine wanted to protest, to tell him not to risk his life for her, but she knew it would be useless. Daniel had made his choice, and nothing she said would change it. Instead, she reached for his hand and held it tight. Be careful, she whispered. Please be careful. I couldn't bear it if something happened to you because of me. Daniel squeezed her hand, his brown eyes warm despite the cold and fear surrounding them. I'm coming back, he promised. And when I do, we're going to have that conversation about courting properly. About building a future together. Hold on to that thought, Catherine. Don't give up on us. Within an hour, Daniel and 3 other volunteers were prepared for the journey into the hills. They had horses, supplies, weapons, everything they'd need for a multi-day search in brutal winter conditions. Catherine helped Daniel pack, her hands moving automatically through the familiar motions of folding clothes and securing supplies, while her mind screamed at the danger he was riding toward. Marcus was desperate now, cornered, and desperate men were capable of terrible things. What if he was armed? What if he hurt Daniel before they could subdue him? What if Daniel never came back? Stop thinking the worst, Daniel said gently, tilting her chin up so she had to meet his eyes. I've survived 5 years on the railroad, Catherine. I know how to handle dangerous men and dangerous situations. Marcus Dalton doesn't scare me. He should, Catherine said. He's not what he appears to be. He'll seem charming, reasonable, but underneath he's ruthless. He won't fight fair. Good thing I'm not planning to fight fair either, Daniel replied with a tight smile. Then, before Catherine could respond, he pulled her close and kissed her properly. Not the gentle kiss they'd shared before, but something deeper, more urgent, full of promise and need. Catherine kissed him back with everything she had, pouring all her fear and hope into that moment, trying to memorize the feel of him against her in case this was the last time. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard. Daniel rested his forehead against hers. "I'm coming back," he said again. "Trust me." "I do," Catherine whispered. "I trust you completely." Then he was gone, riding out into the snow with his companions, and Catherine was left standing in the cold watching until they disappeared into the white wilderness. She stood there long after they were out of sight, ignoring the way her feet went numb and her breath froze in her lungs. Patterson eventually came and physically guided her back inside. But she couldn't shake the terrible feeling that she'd just watched Daniel ride toward his death. That Marcus would win after all. Not by destroying her, but by destroying the man she'd come to love. The waiting was agony. Hours stretched into days with no word from the search party. The storm continued, relentless and brutal, burying the camp under even more snow. Catherine tried to keep busy with her sewing, but her hands shook too badly to manage precise work. She ruined 3 seams and finally gave up, sitting by her window and staring out at the endless white, willing Daniel to appear through the snow. Other women in camp tried to comfort her, bringing her food she couldn't eat, and sitting with her in companionable silence when words were too much. She was grateful for their kindness, but couldn't truly appreciate it through the fog of fear. On the 3rd day, just as the sun was setting and Catherine was beginning to lose all hope, someone shouted from the camp perimeter. "Riders coming in! They're back!" Catherine was out of her cabin before she'd fully registered the words, running through the snow in just her dress and shawl, not caring about the cold or propriety or anything except seeing if Daniel was safe. The search party emerged from the trees, 4 riders as expected, but there was a 5th horse as well, with a man tied across its back like cargo. Even from a distance, Catherine recognized the expensive coat, the dark hair. Marcus. They'd found him. And there, leading the group, sitting tall in his saddle despite obvious exhaustion, was Daniel. Alive. Whole. Safe. Catherine didn't realize she was crying until she felt the tears freeze on her cheeks. Daniel dismounted stiffly, his movements pained, and she threw herself into his arms with complete disregard for who might be watching. He caught her with a grunt of surprise and held her tight, his face buried in her hair. "Told you I'd come back," he murmured against her ear. "Told you to trust me. Are you hurt?" Catherine pulled back just enough to examine him, her hands running over his chest and arms checking for injuries. "Did he hurt you?" "I'm fine," Daniel assured her. "Bruised and frozen, but fine. We found him holed up in one of the old mining cabins just like you thought. He tried to run when he saw us coming, but his horse went lame in the snow. We caught up to him about a mile from the cabin." He glanced over at Marcus's unconscious form. "He fought, tried to shoot his way out, but we subdued him without anyone getting seriously injured. Patterson appeared then, taking charge of Marcus and ordering him locked in the camp's small holding cell until the marshal could come collect him." Catherine watched as they dragged Marcus away, and even unconscious and defeated, he looked malevolent. This wasn't over, she knew. Marcus would have expensive lawyers, would try to talk his way out of the charges, would claim everything was a misunderstanding. But at least for now, he couldn't hurt anyone, couldn't burn anything else, or threaten anyone else. He was contained. "Come on," Daniel said, guiding Catherine back toward the cabins. "Let's get out of the cold. I need to warm up, and you need to stop standing in the snow in just your dress before you freeze." They ended up in Catherine's cabin, the door closed firmly against the winter wind. Daniel sat heavily on the chair by her stove, while Catherine wrapped blankets around him and made hot coffee with trembling hands. She couldn't stop touching him, reassuring herself he was real and safe, running her fingers through his hair to check for wounds, pressing her palm against his chest to feel his heartbeat. Daniel tolerated her fussing with infinite patience, occasionally catching her hand to press a kiss to her palm. "I was so afraid," Catherine finally admitted, sinking onto the cot across from him. "Every minute you were gone, I kept imagining the worst. Marcus shooting you, the cold taking you, something going wrong and you never coming back. I don't think I breathed properly the entire 3 days." Daniel set down his coffee and reached for her, pulling her from the cot to sit on his lap. She went willingly, curling into him, needing the solid warmth of his presence. "I'm here," he said simply. "And Marcus is going away for a long time. Arson, destruction of property, attempted assault on the men who tried to arrest him. The marshal says he's looking at years in territorial prison, even if his lawyers manage to keep him from hanging." He stroked Catherine's hair gently. "It's over, Catherine. Really over. You're free of him." The words should have brought relief, but Catherine found herself crying instead. Great heaving sobs that shook her whole body. All the fear and tension of the past weeks pouring out in a flood she couldn't control. Daniel just held her, rocking slightly, murmuring soothing nonsense while she soaked his shirt with tears. She cried for everything she'd lost in Boston. For her father who'd failed to protect her. For the months of running and hiding and fear. For the girl she'd been before Marcus destroyed her innocence. And finally, when the tears slowed, she cried from relief. Because it was truly over. Because she'd survived. Because she had Daniel holding her and promising her a future. "I love you," Catherine said when she could finally speak again, the words tumbling out before she could second-guess them. "I know it's too soon and probably foolish, but I love you, Daniel. I think I started loving you that first night, when you warmed my frozen feet and gave up your bed for a stranger. You've been nothing but kind and patient and good, and I love you for it." Daniel's arms tightened around her, and when Catherine looked up at his face, she saw tears in his brown eyes too. "I love you too," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Loved you from the moment you sat in my cabin trying to be brave while your feet were freezing off. Loved how you refused to give up. How you kept fighting even when everything seemed hopeless. You're the strongest person I've ever met, Catherine Hayes, and I'd be honored to spend the rest of my life loving you." They kissed then, deep and slow and full of promise. No more fear. No more looking over their shoulders. Just two people who'd found each other in the wilderness and decided they were worth fighting for. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Daniel smiled and said, "So about that proper courting I mentioned. How do you feel about starting tomorrow?" Catherine laughed, the sound bright and genuine. "I feel like I'd rather skip straight to the wedding, but I suppose we should do things properly for once in our lives." "Wedding," Daniel repeated, his eyes lighting up. "I like the sound of that. How long of a courtship are we talking?" "Because I'm thinking maybe a few months. Just long enough for me to build us a proper house, and then we make this official." "A house?" Catherine felt her heart swell at the image of a real home, built by Daniel's hands, where they could start their life together. "You'd build us a house?" "I'd build you anything you wanted," Daniel said seriously. "A house, a workshop for your sewing, a garden for spring planting. Whatever makes you happy, Catherine. That's all I want. To spend every day trying to make you happy." They talked late into the night, making plans for their future. Daniel told her about a piece of land he'd been eyeing near the camp, perfect for building. Catherine described the kind of house she'd always dreamed of, something small and cozy with large windows for natural light to sew by. They discussed what life would be like once the railroad was complete and the camp became a permanent town. How Catherine could open a proper seamstress shop. How Daniel might move into management with the railroad company. Children, maybe, in a few years when they were more settled. A whole future spread out before them, bright with possibility. The next morning, Patterson called a camp meeting to explain what had happened with Marcus Dalton. The territorial marshal had arrived during the night and taken custody of the prisoner, along with detailed statements from Daniel and the other men about what they'd found in the mining cabin, evidence of arson materials. Maps of the camp showing the supply depot circled. Even a journal where Marcus had apparently been recording his thoughts and plans, including explicit threats against Catherine. It was damning, and even Marcus's expensive lawyers would have trouble explaining it away. "Miss Hayes," Patterson said at the end of the meeting, addressing Catherine directly, "I owe you an apology. When I suggested you leave camp, I was thinking only of immediate safety, not about what was right. You didn't deserve to be driven away from your home, because some bastard couldn't accept rejection. I'm glad Daniel convinced me to try a different approach." Catherine felt tears prick at her eyes again. But these were good tears. Tears of gratitude and belonging. "Thank you, Mr. Patterson, for believing me when it mattered, for standing up to Marcus, for giving me a chance here." Patterson waved off the thanks gruffly, but Catherine could see he was pleased. The meeting dispersed, and life in the camp slowly returned to normal. Or rather, to a new normal where Catherine wasn't constantly afraid, where she could walk to the supply office without looking over her shoulder, where she could sleep through the night without nightmares of Marcus finding her. The freedom was intoxicating. True to his word, Daniel began courting Catherine properly. He'd show up at her cabin door in the evenings with small gifts, wildflowers he'd found in a sheltered spot, a book of poetry from the general store in Stone Valley, a beautiful piece of wood he'd carved into a sewing box. They'd take walks together around the camp when weather permitted, talking about everything and nothing. Sometimes he'd bring his guitar, a surprise talent Catherine hadn't known about, and play while she sewed. The other workers teased them good-naturedly about the romance blooming in their midst, but it was friendly teasing. People liked seeing happiness flourish in such a hard place. Patterson commissioned Catherine to make wedding quilts for his daughter back east, a prestigious project that would take months but pay well. Other families in the developing town started seeking out her services too. A mother wanting christening gowns for her new baby, a young couple needing help altering wedding clothes. Catherine's reputation as a skilled seamstress spread beyond the railroad camp to Stone Valley and the surrounding homesteads. She was building something real here, a business and a life. Daniel, meanwhile, kept his promise about building them a house. He worked on it every spare moment, and Catherine would visit the site to watch the walls go up board by board. It was a beautiful little house, sturdy and well-made with large south-facing windows, just like she'd requested. He was building it with care and attention to detail, ensuring every joint was tight and every angle was square. Building them a home that would last. 3 months after Marcus's arrest, a letter arrived from Boston. Catherine's hands shook as she opened it, afraid of what it might contain. But the news inside was better than she dared hope. Marcus had been convicted not just of the Idaho Territory crimes, but also of fraud and embezzlement back in Boston. Apparently, once investigators started looking into his business practices, they'd found years of illegal activities. He'd been swindling investors and manipulating account books to hide his theft. Catherine's father's business partner had been a criminal all along, and her father had never known. Or perhaps had known and chosen to ignore it, for the sake of profit. Either way, Marcus Dalton was going to prison for a very long time. Even better, the letter was from a lawyer, representing several of Marcus's victims. They were pursuing civil cases to recover stolen funds, and the lawyer believed Catherine had grounds to sue for damages related to Marcus's destruction of her reputation and livelihood. If the suits were successful, Catherine might actually recover some money. Not a fortune, but enough to make a real difference. Enough to buy supplies for her seamstress business, maybe even purchase the land Daniel was building their house on. Catherine brought the letter to Daniel that evening, her hands still shaking with disbelief. "It's really over," she said, showing him the pages. "Marcus is finished. His whole empire of lies and manipulation. It's all collapsed. And I might actually get compensation for what he did to me." Daniel read the letter carefully, then set it aside and pulled Catherine into his arms. "This is wonderful news," he said. "But Catherine, even if the lawsuit doesn't work out, even if you never see a penny of compensation, you've already won. You survived. You built a new life. You didn't let him destroy you. That's the real victory." Catherine nodded against his chest, understanding what he meant. The money would be nice, yes, but it wasn't what mattered most. What mattered was that she'd reclaimed her life. She'd found her strength. She'd learned to trust again, and she'd found love in the most unexpected place, with the most unexpected person. "Marry me," Daniel said suddenly. "I know we said we'd wait until the house was finished, but I don't want to wait anymore. Marry me now, Catherine. Let's start our life together." Catherine pulled back to look at his face, saw the love and certainty shining in his brown eyes, and felt her heart overflow with joy. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes, I'll marry you. Tomorrow if we can arrange it, or next week, or whenever. Just yes." Daniel laughed and spun her around, her feet leaving the ground, both of them grinning like fools. When he set her down, he kissed her thoroughly, and Catherine felt like her heart might burst from happiness. After everything she'd been through, all the pain and fear and struggle, she'd found this. She'd found him. She'd found home. They were married 2 weeks later, in a simple ceremony at the camp's community building. Patterson gave Catherine away, since she had no family, and several of the camp women helped her make a wedding dress from beautiful cream-colored silk that had come in on the supply wagon. It wasn't the elaborate Boston society wedding Catherine might have had in another life, but it was perfect. Daniel stood at the makeshift altar in his best clothes, his hair neatly combed for once, and the look in his eyes when he saw Catherine walking toward him was worth more than any grand ceremony could have been. They spoke their vows in front of the whole camp, promising to love and honor each other through whatever life brought. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Daniel kissed Catherine with such tenderness that several women in the audience cried. The celebration afterward was joyful and raucous, with music and dancing and food that the whole camp had contributed to. Catherine danced with her new husband, laughed with friends, and felt a peace she'd never experienced before. This was belonging. This was home. This was love. The house was finished by spring, just as the snow began to melt and the first green shoots appeared in the warming earth. Daniel carried Catherine over the threshold on a bright April morning, both of them laughing as he nearly dropped her on the doorstep. Inside, the house smelled of fresh wood and new beginnings. Catherine walked through the rooms, touching walls her husband had built with his own hands, looking out windows that framed views of mountains and sky. The bedroom was small, but cozy, with a beautiful bed Daniel had crafted. The main room had space for a dining table, and Catherine's sewing corner with those south-facing windows she'd wanted. There was even a small porch where they could sit on summer evenings and watch the sunset. "It's perfect," Catherine said, turning to find Daniel watching her with a soft smile. "Everything I dreamed of and more." Daniel crossed to her and took her hands. "This is just the beginning," he promised. "We'll fill this house with life and love and laughter. Maybe children someday if we're blessed. We'll build a garden and watch it grow. We'll grow old here together, Catherine. That's my promise to you. A lifetime of growing old together in the home we've made." Catherine reached up to cup his face, this good man who'd saved her life and then saved her heart. "I love you," she said simply. "Thank you for seeing me when I felt invisible, for believing me when no one else did, for fighting for me when I was too tired to fight for myself. Thank you for giving me this life." "Thank you for letting me love you," Daniel replied, "for trusting me enough to take that risk, for choosing me and this life when you could have had something easier, safer." He kissed her gently. "You're the bravest person I know, Catherine. Don't ever forget that." As spring turned to summer, their life together fell into a comfortable rhythm. Catherine's seamstress business flourished as more settlers arrived with the completed railroad. She took on an apprentice, a young girl from Stone Valley who showed promise with a needle. Daniel received a promotion to senior foreman, overseeing multiple railroad projects throughout the territory. They were building something lasting, both of them, creating a legacy that would outlive them. The money from the lawsuit came through in late summer, more than Catherine had expected. They used it to buy the land their house sat on, and to expand Catherine's workshop. She hired another seamstress to help with the growing workload, and together they created beautiful clothes and useful items for the growing community. Catherine found joy in teaching others her craft, in passing on the skills her mother had taught her so many years ago. Word eventually reached them that Marcus Dalton had died in prison, his health broken by harsh conditions, and his pride destroyed by his fall from society's heights. Catherine felt no joy at the news, but she felt closure. The man who'd tried to destroy her was gone, and she'd outlived his hatred. She'd built a life so full of love and purpose that Marcus's shadow couldn't touch it anymore. On their first wedding anniversary, Daniel surprised Catherine with a gift. A journal bound in soft leather, the pages blank and waiting. "I thought you might want to write your story," he explained. "The real story of Catherine Miller, who became Catherine Hayes, who survived scandal and winter and a man's cruelty to build something beautiful. Not for anyone else to read, unless you want that. Just for you, so you never forget how strong you are." Catherine opened the journal, ran her fingers over the empty pages, and felt tears well up. She'd spent so long trying to forget her past, to bury Catherine Miller and pretend she'd never existed. But Daniel was right. That past was part of her story, part of what had made her the woman she was now, strong and capable, and brave enough to love again. She shouldn't hide from it. She should own it. That night, by lamplight, Catherine began to write. She wrote about her mother and father, about growing up in Boston, about learning to sew and finding joy in creation. She wrote about Marcus's betrayal and the scandal, about the fear and shame and desperate flight west, about nearly dying of frostbite on her first night in Idaho Territory, and the gentle railroad worker who'd saved her. She wrote about falling in love with Daniel, about fighting for their chance at happiness, about building a home and a life from nothing but determination and hope. She wrote her truth, all of it, and found healing in the telling. As summer faded into fall, Catherine discovered she was pregnant. The news filled her with equal parts joy and terror. She'd always wanted children, but the thought of bringing a new life into the world felt overwhelming. What if she wasn't a good mother? What if she passed on her fears and scars to her child? But Daniel was thrilled, already planning additions to the house for a nursery, already dreaming of teaching their son or daughter to ride and fish and appreciate the beauty of the Idaho Territory wilderness. "You're going to be a wonderful mother," he assured Catherine when she confessed her fears. "You're strong and loving, and you know how to survive. What more could a child need?" He placed his hand gently on her still, flat stomach. "This baby is lucky to have you, just like I'm lucky to have you." Winter came again, but this time, Catherine wasn't afraid of the cold. She had a solid house to shelter in, a husband to keep her warm, and a community that cared about her well-being. She spent the long winter evenings sewing baby clothes and watching her belly grow. Daniel would read to her from his poetry books, or they'd play cards by the fire, or simply sit in comfortable silence, enjoying each other's presence. This was contentment, Catherine realized. This was what happiness felt like when you'd earned it through struggle and survived to appreciate it. Their daughter was born on a cold March morning, just as the snow was beginning to melt again. Catherine labored through the night with the camp's midwife and Daniel holding her hand. And when the baby finally arrived with a lusty cry, Catherine felt her heart expand in ways she hadn't known were possible. The midwife placed the tiny, perfect creature on Catherine's chest, and she looked down into eyes that were already beginning to show hints of Daniel's brown, and she fell completely in love all over again. "What should we name her?" Daniel asked, his voice thick with emotion as he stroked the baby's downy hair. Catherine thought of her mother, of the woman who'd taught her to sew and told her a skill would keep her from starving. The woman who died too young, but whose wisdom had saved Catherine's life. "Rose," she said, "after my mother. Rose Margaret, if that's all right with you." Daniel nodded, tears streaming down his weathered face. "Rose Margaret," he repeated. "It's perfect. She's perfect. You're perfect." He leaned down to kiss Catherine gently. "Thank you. For this. For everything." As Rose grew from infant to toddler, the railroad camp transformed into a proper town. Stone Valley expanded with new businesses and homes. The territorial marshal's office became permanent. A church was built, and a real school. The rough frontier settlement was becoming civilized, becoming a place where families could put down roots and thrive. Catherine's seamstress business was now one of the most successful in town, and Daniel had moved into a management position with the railroad company that allowed him to work from an office instead of out in the elements. They were prospering in ways Catherine had never imagined possible during those dark days in Boston. But more than the material success, they were happy. Truly, deeply happy, in a way that came from having survived hardship together and come out stronger for it. Their marriage was solid, built on mutual respect and genuine partnership. They shared responsibilities, made decisions together, supported each other's dreams. It was everything Catherine's parents' marriage had never been, everything she'd thought she'd lost forever when Marcus destroyed her reputation. On a warm summer evening, 3 years after Rose's birth, Catherine sat on their porch, watching Daniel teach their daughter to catch fireflies in the gathering dusk. Rose's delighted laughter rang out every time she managed to cup one of the glowing insects in her small hands. And Daniel's patient encouragement made Catherine's heart swell with love. This was her family, her home, her hard-won happiness. Daniel caught her watching and smiled. That special smile he reserved just for her. He said something to Rose, who nodded seriously and toddled over to Catherine with her hands cupped protectively. "Mama, look, I caught a light bug," she announced proudly, and Catherine dutifully admired the firefly before helping Rose release it back into the night. "Time for bed, little one," Catherine said, gathering her daughter into her arms. Rose protested sleepily, but didn't fight as Catherine carried her inside to the small bedroom they'd added to the house. As she tucked Rose into bed and sang the lullaby her own mother had once sung to her, Catherine felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over her. For this child, for Daniel, for this life they'd built together, for surviving long enough to find happiness after heartbreak. When Rose was finally asleep, Catherine returned to the porch where Daniel waited with 2 cups of tea. She settled beside him on the bench he'd built, his arm coming around her shoulders automatically. And they sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge. "Do you ever think about Boston?" Daniel asked eventually. "About what your life might have been like if things had gone differently?" Catherine considered the question honestly. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but not with regret. If Marcus hadn't driven me away, I never would have come here, never would have met you, never would have known this kind of happiness." She turned to look at her husband's profile in the starlight. "Everything I went through, all the pain and fear and struggle, it led me here. To you, to Rose, to this life. I wouldn't change it even if I could." Daniel pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "I love you, Catherine. More every day, if that's possible. You're the best thing that ever happened to me." "I love you too," Catherine replied, settling against his chest where she could hear his heartbeat steady and strong. "Thank you for giving me this life, for seeing worth in a frightened seamstress with a scandalous past, for loving me despite everything." "Not despite everything," Daniel corrected gently. "Because of everything. Because you're strong and brave, and you refuse to let the world break you. That's who you are, Catherine. That's who you've always been. I just helped you remember it." They sat together as the summer night deepened around them. 2 people who'd found each other against impossible odds and built something beautiful from the ruins of their pasts. Inside their house, their daughter slept peacefully, safe and loved. Around them, their town thrived, growing and changing with each passing season. And ahead of them stretched the rest of their lives together, full of possibility and promise. Catherine thought about the journal Daniel had given her, now nearly full of her story written in her own hand. She documented everything from those terrible days in Boston to this perfect moment on her porch in Idaho Territory. Her story of survival and second chances, of learning to trust again, of finding love in the frozen wilderness. Someday, maybe, Rose would read it and understand what her mother had overcome to give her this life. Would see that strength wasn't about never falling down, but about getting back up every time life knocked you down. But for now, Catherine was content to simply be here, to feel Daniel's arms around her and know she was home. To listen to the night sounds of their town settling into sleep, to count her blessings and marvel at how far she'd come from that terrified woman who'd stumbled through a blizzard into a stranger's cabin what felt like a lifetime ago. "It's a beautiful night," Catherine said softly. "It is," Daniel agreed. "But then, every night is beautiful when I get to spend it with you." Catherine smiled and closed her eyes, perfectly content. She'd survived the worst winter of her life and emerged into spring. She'd been broken by betrayal and healed by love. She'd lost everything and found something infinitely more valuable. This was her happily ever after, hard-won and deeply cherished. This was home, and she was finally